What will the future look like? In his most recent November appearance on the Tim Ferriss Show, entrepreneur and investor Balaji Srinivasan presents a cohesive explanation of the current world and plausible scenarios of how things will play out. I found Balaji's theories so mesmerizing, I listened to the 4.5-hour podcast several times, then read and took notes on the transcript. Listening to this episode was like reading a book, so like I do with my book summaries, I wanted to improve my own understanding of the content. So here is a podcast summarizing a podcast in my own words. Needless to say, the podcast is worth listening to, and since this is just a summary, you should absolutely listen to it over on the Tim Ferriss Show to get the full context. This is Love Your Work, and I'm David Kadavy. One of the main forces at play in world events, according to Balaji, is the decline of nation-states. He presents this idea in reference to a prescient 25-year-old book called The Sovereign Individual, which he cites in this podcast appearance and others. Since the nation-state is declining, it is becoming increasingly difficult for countries to control their citizens. When it's hard to control citizens, it's hard to collect tax revenue to fund institutions. This loss of control is accelerating with the rise of remote work, catalyzed by the coronavirus pandemic. As more people have been able to work from anywhere, they've become increasingly aware of how local laws and taxes affect their lives. The control of a nation-state over its people is limited to the extent that people have the right to what Balaji summarizes as exit. If you're unable to leave a place, either because the government is oppressive or because you're tied down because, say, you have land to tend and a flock of sheep, the government has more leeway in what policies they can enforce. If people can exit their jurisdictions, whether that's a country, a state, or a city, then citizens stop being subjects that jurisdictions can extract resources from and start being customers that jurisdictions want to appeal to. We've of course seen this for a long time as cities have given tax breaks or other perks to compete over companies shopping for jurisdictions in which to place their corporate headquarters. But citizens are starting to look more like customers as smaller players have exited en masse. For example, lots of people and companies have been leaving California for Texas in search of less state control. Balaji points out that not everyone has to exit to influence policies, but the fact that some do is tremendous leverage on any system. An example Balaji cites of this struggle happened when New York State introduced the BIT license, a series of regulations required for companies to do certain kinds of cryptocurrency transactions. Balaji characterizes New York's posture in introducing these regulations as, "We're New York, what are you going to do? We're the center of the world." At least 10 crypto companies then left New York, including Kraken, Bitfinex, and Poloniex. In some cases, they had to pack up and move. In other cases, they just stopped servicing New York customers. New York apparently overestimated their leverage, and companies left for other jurisdictions who were more accommodating to their customers. Something Balaji doesn't talk about much, but that is a major theme in The Sovereign Individual and is relevant to the decline of state control, is declining returns on violence, at least at the state level. You can think of a nation-state as a collection of people who contribute taxes in exchange for protection. Serfs used to pay to their feudal lords the returns of farming on their plots of land in exchange for protection. Businesses in organized crime-controlled neighborhoods pay a fee to the mob so their businesses won't burn down. U.S. taxpayers pay taxes. The U.S. keeps a strong military that defends the interests of those taxpayers and protects U.S. taxpayers' green bill privilege by ensuring the U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency. A relevant observation that stands out to me, Sapiens author Yuval Noah Harari once essentially said that wars used to be about control over natural resources. You can invade a country and get control over such resources and maybe even control over labor. But China can't invade Silicon Valley, force all the engineers and entrepreneurs to work, and by doing so extract the resources there. That's a decline in the returns on state violence, on the state level at least. The main conflict Balaji sees playing out in 20 to 40 years is between centralized China and decentralized world. China is a nation-state, and one of the main forces at play is the decline of the nation-state, so how does that work? As Balaji describes it, China is the most centralized government. It has root access to everything, much like you have over your computer if you have the root password. We're seeing that in the coronavirus pandemic. If there's a couple cases in the city, China can and will shut down everything, and they have total surveillance over their citizens. This high degree of centralization will be, according to Balaji, an advantage in the short and medium term. It's been an advantage in the coronavirus pandemic. I think the implication is that in an interconnected world with so much technological power, being highly centralized is the only way for a government to retain control over its citizens and thus extract resources to keep itself running. If Balaji thinks it will take 20 to 40 years for China's centralized model to cease being an advantage, that implies that a decentralized world will emerge as an opposing force within that 20 to 40 years. So as less centralized governments lose the ability to stay together and fund themselves from their citizens, that will fragment into smaller jurisdictions, sometimes based upon geography, other times based upon ideology. From that no doubt messy process would emerge new models for organizing people and resources. These models would rise to become so much better that they rival the reigning world power in this scenario, China. The idea of fragmented jurisdictions competing and developing better models makes me think of the theories presented by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Diamond theorizes that Europe came to dominate the West hundreds of years ago because Europe had itself fragmented into many competing nation-states. And Europe's east-west orientation also meant new methods of agriculture or livestock management easily traveled from one jurisdiction to another. If a new method was developed in Spain, it could be used in France. Those two nation-states would then compete to improve that method, along with other neighboring countries, and any improvements could easily be traded back and forth, thus optimizing a better method. I say better in air quotes because obviously European dominance of the West is morally unsavory. Their methods were better merely from a game theory standpoint. If there is one playing field, in this case the world, the player with Europe's set of characteristics probably gains control over that playing field in most scenarios. Other methods could be considered better depending upon by what criteria you rate them. Since agricultural technology was so important to the success of a nation at that stage of global development, the portability of technology depended a lot upon climate. Thus, Diamond's theory that continents with long east-west axes and thus similarity in climates amongst jurisdictions innovated rapidly. But in a world where innovation in digital technologies is so important, technological innovations are more portable, and so an idea can be iterated upon and improved within every jurisdiction in the world. Balaji presents a theory of three forces that are and will continue to be struggling for power over the coming decades. I think the implication here is many jurisdictions will emerge with various levels of these values. As these jurisdictions compete, some will emerge as winners that collectively act as a decentralized world which competes with centralized China. Those three forces are woke capital, communist capital, and crypto capital. The three organizations that represent each of these respectively are the New York Times, the Chinese Communist Party, and Bitcoin. A little more about each of these. Woke capital, as embodied by NYT, says you should sympathize. Communist capital, as embodied by CCP, says you should submit. Crypto capital, as embodied by BTC, or Bitcoin maximalists in its extreme, says you should be sovereign. Both woke capital and crypto capital essentially say you are powerful, but woke capital finishes that sentence with and you should apologize for that power. Crypto capital finishes "you are powerful" by saying, and you should be self-sufficient. Communist capital, instead of "you are powerful," says "we are powerful," but like woke capital, encourages a posture of submission or bowing down as you make yourself subservient to that power. Crypto capital, on the other hand, encourages a confident posture with head held high. Any of these forces taken to their extreme is bad. Different jurisdictions will embody different mixes of these values, and Balaji hopes will reach an optimal decentralized center. We'll hopefully have a decentralized world with a good mixture of concern for one's fellow human, self-sufficiency, and personal responsibility within the populace, and some degree of control by competent leaders and organizations who are qualified to make decisions for large swaths of people. The New York Times and the American press at large seem to be the incumbents in America, and maybe it's because Balaji leans toward crypto capital himself, he's the former CTO of Coinbase, that he spends a good portion of the conversation criticizing the press. A resonant quote Balaji says is common: "If China's got a state-controlled press, America's a press-controlled state." In other words, in China, politicians fire journalists. In the US, journalists get politicians fired. If journalists have so much influence over politics, Balaji poses the question, why isn't the US establishment led by more competent people? The media has so much influence over American politics, our remaining leaders are those who are best at using the media to gain power, not those who are actually competent in their domains. By contrast, Balaji says, the Chinese system is led by people who think more like venture capitalists or technologists. They can think ahead and plan for various scenarios. He cites China's decision to block outside social media companies starting way back in 2009 as prescient, probably preventing an Arab Spring-like uprising. Since the US establishment do not think like VCs or technologists, they don't actually know how the world works, so everything is a surprise. As Balaji says, the US establishment is always behind the eight ball. Layman is a surprise. Bear is a surprise. COVID is a surprise. Trump is a surprise. Afghanistan's a surprise. Everything is a surprise. He presents as examples various article titles by American journalists, such as Why Facebook Will Never Make a Significant Profit, Amazon.bomb, or Google's Toughest Search is for a Business Model. He says, these journos are not off by 50%. You can't just read their article and think you're being sophisticated by discounting it. Their mental model of the world is often off by 10,000 or 100,000x. Yet, news organizations, which are for-profit endeavors, advertise themselves as arbiters of facts. Fox News used the tagline, fair and balanced. The Washington Post's masthead says, democracy dies in darkness. And the New York Times ran a billboard in Times Square that just said truth. A weapon in the struggle amongst the forces of woke, communist, and crypto capital is Russell's conjugation, also known as emotive conjugation. Russell's conjugation is using different words with different emotional valence to describe the same thing. When philosopher Bertrand Russell talked about it on a BBC broadcast in 1948, he used the example, I have reconsidered the matter, you have changed your mind, he has gone back on his word. Balaji uses the example, he doxes, she leaks, but the New York Times investigates, pointing out that newspapers are essentially for-profit intelligence agencies. An average person can't just dig through somebody's trash and put them under surveillance, but that's what newspapers do. Obviously, anyone can use Russell's conjugation, but since the media has so much power to shape our conception of reality, it's especially dangerous in their hands. And if the idea of the media shaping our reality is news to you, listen to my summaries of media theory books such as Understanding Media, The Image, and Amusing Ourselves to Death. An example Balaji cites of Russell's conjugation in action is that the New York Times in 2012 published an article called How Punch Protected the Times about how dual-class stock helped keep the newspaper in the hands of the Sulzberger family. But in 2019, they criticized Facebook's use of dual-class stock by publishing You can't fire Mark Zuckerberg's kids. To be fair, they were both opinion columns. The main force that will lead the move toward decentralization is Bitcoin. But will Bitcoin keep growing in influence, or will it be made irrelevant? Since China recently cut off mining of Bitcoin within their borders, Balaji says it's unlikely there will be a successful technical attack on Bitcoin. China was the biggest potential threat on that front, and Bitcoin survived. There's still some possibility of software attacks, such as a zero-day attack, a very popular client having a vulnerability, a supply chain attack in which a library is included in the code and isn't caught, or quantum decryption being developed before quantum encryption. One potential threat to Bitcoin is the US government seizing Bitcoin, much like FDR did with gold in 1933. With Executive Order 6102, FDR made it illegal to hoard gold coins, bullion, and certificates, which I noticed was a nice Russell conjugation. Instead of hoarding, he could have called it saving. Everyone had to turn in their gold in exchange for a low, fixed price so the Federal Reserve could issue more gold-backed money. Could the government do the same for Bitcoin? Balaji considers this an unlikely scenario, or at least a scenario unlikely to be successful, because he says history is running in reverse. That is, in 1933, the world was moving toward centralization, and today the world is moving away from centralization. Balaji sees the peak of centralization as 1950, when there was one telephone company, AT&T, two superpowers, US and USSR, and 3 television stations, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Moving toward that, the Western frontier closed, the Spanish flu pandemic spread, there was the rise of the robber barons and private banking, the right and left were fighting in the streets, and inflation ran rampant in Weimar Germany. Moving in reverse, we have the internet frontier opening, the COVID pandemic, the rise of tech billionaires and crypto, the right and left fighting in the streets, and what Balaji describes as Weimar America with accelerating inflation. Additionally, in 1933, FDR had the world's smartest people helping him in his brain trust. Today, the smartest people are no longer working with the government. So, Balaji feels that if the US were to attempt to seize Bitcoin, they wouldn't be able to pull it off because history is running in reverse. I'll add that it seems that it would be a tough thing to justify to the public. Executive Order 6102 was at least ostensibly for the purposes of making sure the currency was backed by enough gold. I struggle to imagine a palatable justification for seizing Bitcoin from private citizens. A big idea Balaji talks about, and that Tim Ferriss agrees is a big idea, is the DeFi matrix. Turning an asset into money is called a liquidity event because money is a liquid asset. But increasingly, every asset can simply be traded directly for another asset on the DeFi matrix. For example, it's extremely easy to exchange any cryptocurrency for any other cryptocurrency. Supposedly, the DeFi matrix will make it possible to price things we couldn't price before. Balaji uses examples such as a megabyte on your hard drive, a JPEG, or a minute of your time, which I already do on Clarity.fm. He describes this as being like when every newspaper went online and Google News was indexing all of them. Suddenly they were all competing against each other, and local newspapers that were just syndicating AP stories couldn't compete anymore. Are you struggling to see the connection there? If all assets can be exchanged directly for one another, then currencies are no longer dependent upon geography. Suddenly, smaller countries such as Switzerland, Singapore, or Dubai have an opportunity to compete with their currencies on a global scale. They can add privacy features or Bitcoin backing. So even if you don't trade a megabyte on your hard drive directly for a cup of sugar, you can at least more easily choose what liquid currency you convert to. This makes Bitcoin as like a world government placing a constraint on every state. If a country spends more than they have, people who hold the currency can exit to BTC or the DeFi matrix. I've covered the main thread of this conversation, but it's extremely wide-ranging, and this summary is, of course, no substitute for actually listening to the conversation. Some ideas I'd like to give honorable mention, which you'll learn more about if you listen to the episode, are Bitcoin as a money battery that uses the surplus of renewable energy sources. Blockchain explores as the stealth threat to search engines, how data becomes money when stored on the blockchain, thus making blockchain companies more secure, how data stored on the blockchain makes it difficult to spread falsehoods, what it means to be a capital allocator, and why we need more of them, the principal agent problem, and how automation will relegate management to the arrangement of automation, unbundling and rebundling, why San Francisco is like a terrible product with great legacy distribution, how city coins will turn not in my backyard into yes in my backyard, Bitcoin as a parallel to the Protestant Reformation. There you have it. I wish I knew enough to intelligently disagree with Balaji somewhere, but I personally wanted to digest the conversation as it's a wide-ranging and cohesive picture that gives the appearance of being correct. Go listen to the full episode to learn more. Mind management, not time management is a Kindle deal. Amazon has hand-selected it. This is a big honor for a promotional discount. It's only $2.49 on Amazon.com and Amazon.ca. It ends March 31st, so go grab it now. Love Your Work is brought to you exclusively by our Patreon supporters, including top supporters Jeffrey Mason and Bob Rosen. The theme music for Love Your Work is At Sea by Dorena from the album About Everything and More, by arrangement with Deep Elm Records at deepelm.com. Love Your Work is a production of Cataby Inc.